Hey everybody, welcome back. Hi, good to see you guys. Hey Kenzie. Welcome back. Hi, good to see you guys. Hey Kenzie. I have my phone on the same live stream. Come on. So weird to hear myself speak. Okay, yes. Hi there guys. Want to go to the beach? I know, I'm sorry for that. But it's still there, and it'll still be there. So it'll eventually be there when you're ready to go back. But it's great to see you guys today. Hello to everybody. We still have a few minutes until the class time actually gets started, but anybody wants to say hi or just throw out a little comment or greeting, I'm happy to see you guys. And we have another key meeting today on this philosophy of mind material that we're just starting with. Be right back. Let me get a minute clock for this. All right, hello everybody. Hi Daniel and everybody else. How's it going out there? Cool. Okay. Is my last name German? No, it's a Slavic type name. So have you ever heard of Yugoslavia? It used to exist, but it broke apart in the 90s into like 5 different republics that are now all independent nations. So you got Serbia, Bosnia, Croatia, Slovenia. Anyway, there's like 5 of them, but anyway, well, there was the Kosovo War. That's when the United States intervened in the Balkans because there's basically like crazy sectarian strife going on between the Serbians, Bosnians, and Croatians. So there's like total civil war in that part of the world, which resulted in the breakup of the society into these different federated republics. But they're no longer federated. They're just independent now. Yeah, there's a long history of the Slavic part of Europe. After World War II, for a long time, there was this guy Tito that ruled, and he kind of somehow kept all these different warring factions, these ethnic groups, in line, and so that they could live together civilly. But then after he died in the later 80s, it seemed like everyone got at each other's throats. There was like some far right nationalism happening with some of the Serbians, and basically they wanted to like encroach on the Bosnian part of Yugoslavia. Anyway, I mean, I was born in California, and I just know the stories of this stuff because I've researched the history of it. But when I was in high school back in the 90s, I remember reading a lot about it. And of course, Clinton deployed NATO to try and intervene because Milosevic, which was the Serbian president at the time, was basically trying to take over the entire Yugoslavian former republic and make it just for the Serbians. It's a complicated story. It's actually quite interesting to read about it. There's a documentary called The Death of Yugoslavia. It's like, anybody's interested in it, it's like a 6-part documentary series. But that's where my last name comes from. It would be Croatian, I guess, now. But when I was born, there was only Yugoslavia, and Croatia was part of it. Now Croatia is its own country. But I guess that's what I would claim if you just looked at my last name. Any name that ends with like ICH is going to be something that's derived from Eastern Europe and that part of the world. Yeah, thanks for the question. I should probably know more about this stuff, but I just know the basics. There was civil war happened in the 90s. Is the final paper due May 6th? Well, I gave the announcement out, and I want to double check it, but I believe that I said it's due on the last day of class, which is what? That is the 6th, is it not? I think so. So here, I'll just verify for you. Can anybody else verify that, though? Kenzie, are you saying yes to Soroush right there? That's according to my memory correct. Yes, May 6th, Wednesday, last day of regular class meetings before finals week. Of course, my phone's having trouble getting there, but yeah, it is the 6th. Thanks, Robert, and to you others for confirming that that's correct information. So I just changed the due date by 1 week, so it's modified, and it's due, that means 2 weeks from today. So you have 2 full weeks left to get the paper together. Okay. All right, so we're pretty much there at class time. Welcome back, everybody. Glad to see you guys here. So today, we're going to continue to expand on our new topic, which is the philosophy of mind. At the tail end last time, I just started to introduce the subject to you, so let me bring you guys back up to speed, and then we can go from there. Okay, so first of all, this new subject in philosophy that we're studying, which is called philosophy of mind, it's all about consciousness, the mental, the life of the mind, perception, experience. You know, right now, you can think about like anything in your mind that you want, but what is the whole concept of mental behavior and thought? Is there something about this thing that you call the mind that is different from the brain? Or is it really just this brain that you have in your skull, which is the sole basis that's responsible for your ability to think, perceive, and have consciousness? So when we ask questions about consciousness, like what's it based on? Is it just physical or is it not physical? Could you give a physical explanation of the phenomenon of subjectivity and consciousness? Could machines ever have consciousness? Is that even possible? When you ask these types of questions, when you inquire into the deep nature of what it is to be a thinking thing, you're dealing with the philosophy of mind. Okay, and then there are these 2 major positions in the philosophy of mind that we started to describe. So some people hold the view called monism. Monists say that everything in the whole universe is just made out of one kind of substance. On the other hand, there's what is called dualism. And dualists believe, no, the whole universe and everything within it is actually made out of 2 different types of substances. So what are these different substances that are being mentioned by either theory? Okay, so one type of substance is claimed as physical matter. And what is that? It's anything that's extended in space. The ultimate constituent of physical matter is generally referred to as the atom. So that's one of the possible substances, stuff that takes up room in this universe and has mass and is built out of atoms. The other type of substance that is being contrasted with that is so-called mind. And don't confuse the word mind in the philosophic usage of the word with the brain, because what the mind is claimed to be is a thing that is got no extension in space, has no physical size, shape, volume, or mass. So it's literally like a 0 point. It has no position or place in space because it's got no extension. But at the same time, somehow this is a thinking thing. So it's thinking, it's consciousness, but it's got no extension, kind of like a spirit or a soul. Now, monism, there are 2 types. You guys remember that? One type of monism says that everything in this world, including you and your consciousness, is made out of matter. On that view, the consciousness that you exhibit right now is just the process of the brain. And without a physical brain in working order, there couldn't possibly be consciousness. That's what the physicalist would say. Another type of monism is idealism, and it's kind of relegated to the margins of serious discussions anymore. But what that says is that nothing in this world is made out of matter, and everything is just a mental idea. Maybe God is the one that thinks of all the things, keeping them to appear as physical objects which exist in reality, but there's no ultimate material basis for them. There's just pure consciousness and thought. So anyways, setting idealism aside, we are really interested in this debate, the debate between physicalist monism and dualism. Okay, so what is dualism again? Dualism says that there's not just the one or the other. It's not just all matter or all mind, but there's a combination of both. The universe is made out of matter and also mind. So matter is just anything extended in space, and mind is anything that lacks extension and has got the ability to think. Now, we are going to study arguments on both sides of this debate. And we had just started to try and reveal Descartes' argument for dualism at the tail end of the last lecture. So we're going to jump right back into that and try and understand a very famous, powerful historical argument given by René Descartes for the dualist position. Okay, so right now we're referring again to this person, René Descartes, the great French philosopher of the early modern period, who lived from 1596 until 1650. and who in 1641 published a very famous book, which is just called The Meditations. Okay, so Meditations by Descartes in 1641, and what we're attending to right now is the 6th chapter of that book, which is just called Meditation 6. All right, so I'm just writing down there the identifying information for the subject of today's lecture. Now with that, let's erase, because I need a lot of space. This argument is very long and there's a lot of steps in it. I just wanted to note for you guys, for your notes and for your mind, that that's the author, text, and publication date. So what are we taking away from that 6th chapter of Meditations? Descartes' argument for dualism. Okay, now we've studied a couple of big arguments in this class. We studied, starting from day one, ontological argument, cosmological argument, argument from design, problem of evil, the argument that utilitarianism is a theory for swine, the response to that. So philosophy is just built on the construction of logical argumentation and then critique and attempt at rebuttal, okay? In this case, we're looking at yet another argument, and this is the argument Descartes gives in his book, The Meditations, to try and prove the case for dualism. Now, just a quick reminder about the way arguments are written out in logic and philosophy. The way they're written is that you have a sequence of what are called premises that are given in a list, and at the end of those premises, at the bottom, you have the conclusion of the argument, the thing that you're trying to demonstrate or prove based on those premises. So the premises are like the evidence or the reasons, and the conclusion is the result proven by the premises. In mathematics, you guys have studied elementary math, and sometimes you've seen this type of structure in a math problem. 2 + 2 = 4. Now, in this way of looking at the mathematical statement, we have the sum here at the bottom, and above that sum total are the factors that amount to this sum plus the mathematical operation of addition. So you see the stuff that leads to the result and then the result below. In logic, it's kind of like that, except we're not dealing with numbers, we're dealing with propositions. So in logic, the conclusion is shown at the bottom, and all of the individual premises that are supposed to lead to that conclusion are provided above. So I'm going to walk you guys through this big argument that Descartes gives for dualism. There's a lot of premises of this argument, so it's going to take a while to fully explain it. Earlier, a couple weeks back, we studied the first 2 meditations, the first 2 chapters of his book. And in the first 2 chapters, basically Descartes establishes that he's looking for certainty. He thinks that we need to find out what is certain so that we can use it as the foundations of science. He says, let's use the method of doubt to determine what is certain. That method says to assume that something is false if there's any way that it could be doubted. And by means of this method, he thought we would be able to, come to discover what is absolutely certain. With the method of doubt being used, all kinds of things can be doubted. Like he says, for example, that you can doubt that anything you perceive with the 5 senses is true. You can also doubt that math and logic is true. But one thing that you can't possibly doubt is that you yourself exist. That's kind of where we closed our earlier discussions of the meditations. Now we're coming back and we're looking at meditation number 6, the last chapter. Okay, so in this 6th chapter of the meditations, Descartes believes that he's capable of proving that God exists, and also that he's capable of proving, based on the existence of God, that dualism is true. The reference that he makes to this long argument that I'm going to show on the board in the 6th meditation is a little indirect, because we basically have got 3 chapters that our text does not include, chapter 3, 4, and 5. So I'm going to try and in the text of chapter 6. So here's the argument, and it begins with this first premise. I'm going to number each premise as seen here, 1, 2, 3, 4, etc. So the first premise of this Cartesian argument for dualism says this: using the method of doubt, I'm able to doubt everything perceived by the senses and even math and logic. So that's the first opening step. Using the method of doubt, and even math and logic. Okay, so first premise, you see it here. It says that when you're using that method of doubt, which again, what is it? It says to assume that something is false if there's any possible way of doubting it. Okay, so using the method of doubt, I'm able to doubt all those things. Everything perceived by the senses can be doubted. Why? Because it's possible that whatever you think you're perceiving is really just being experienced in a dream state that you're in right now. So because of the possibility of lifelike realistic dreams, maybe we cannot count on the fact that our perception is telling us about the real world around us. So dreams provide the reason for doubting the senses. Math and logic, he says, that can be doubted too because of the possible existence of an external deceiver, like an evil demon, manipulating your ability to even do basic mathematical operations correctly. So the method of doubt eliminates certainty about a whole bunch of stuff. But one thing still is certain, even with that method of doubt. Who can remember that? He says, despite this point, number one, despite that, something still does remain certain. So there's this one thing that the method of doubt cannot touch. What is that? He says there's this one and only thing that even the method of doubt cannot make you doubt it. So what is this absolutely certain thing that Descartes is talking to you about here? That you yourself exist, exactly. Why is that absolutely certain and can't be doubted? For the basic reason that you're thinking. You know, just because you're thinking, you know you exist. Even if everything you perceive is not real, it's all fake. You're thinking and you're contemplating, and therefore you think, so you must exist. So that's premise two. Despite this, I know for certain that I exist, at least as a mind, because I'm thinking. Okay, so that's premise two. At least as a mind. And why? Well, because I am thinking. Okay, so that's the second step in the argument. Let's just kind of focus on what's being said here. The first premise claims that the method of doubt leads to doubts about almost everything. Everything you perceive with your senses, even your mathematical and logical intuitions can be doubted. But nonetheless, there is this one thing that can't be doubted. And what is it? It's that you exist, at least as a mind. And why is that certain? Because you are thinking. Why did I have to include this little clause, at least as a mind? Because you know yourself to exist due to the fact that you're thinking. But you don't know whether or not the body that you're perceiving with your eyes and so on is real, because your eyes themselves and everything else you perceive with the five senses could just be like a false illusion that's formed in a dream. But one thing you can take away and take to the bank for absolutely 100% dead certain is that you exist, even if you don't have a body, you exist at least as the thinking mind because of the fact that you're thinking. Okay, so that's the second step of his argument. Now, like I told you, there's many premises of this argument, and due to limitations of the board size, you know, I'm working with this board space here, I'll have to frequently erase, clear the board, and then add new information. So hopefully those two premises are right there in your notes, and if they're not, you can always go back to watch the replay and take those notes again, but I'm going to continue and erase the board. Let's move on to premise 3. But it's all the same argument, so in your notes, these numbered premises should still continue in the same list. Okay, so premise 3. So what we have now is this piece of information. You exist. Maybe everything else doesn't exist. Maybe even your body doesn't exist, but you, this thinking thing, exists, at least because you're thinking. So next is this. Since you're a thinking thing that exists, we know for a fact that you have ideas, at least. So you have different ideas in your mind. In your mind, there are ideas. And he calls out one of them because he says there's this one idea in your mind, which is bigger and more special than all the other ones. It's a unique idea. So let me see if we can come up with this. In my mind, there are ideas. Okay, including the idea of what do you think he's talking about here? I'm gonna definitely tell you, but if you had to guess, he wants to mention to you that there's this one kind of special idea in your mind of a being that is beyond anything else you could think of. It's not the idea of existence, it's the idea of a being, but not just any being. Okay, you're right, guys. Good. Sarush, Kenzie, Abraham, God. That's what this is going to say. In my mind, there are ideas, including the idea of God. He's just saying we all have an idea of God in our mind, okay? But that is leverage for him. That opens up the next step in the argument. So like tracing our steps back, starting from the first premise. If you use the method of doubt, you can doubt anything and everything except for the knowledge that you exist as a mind because you're thinking. Okay, well, in that mind that is thinking, there are different ideas, but one of those ideas is the idea of God. Now, more on this idea of God. He says the idea of God is unique. It's unique among all the ideas in your head because it alone is the idea of an infinite being. Okay, so he says that the idea of God is unique because it is the idea of an infinite being. Okay, so at this point in his argument, the only thing that you're saying you really know for sure is that you yourself exist, maybe minus your body, but you yourself, at least the mind exists, and that mind has many different ideas, but one of them is the idea of God. Now, about that idea of God, it's different, it's special, it's unique. It has a sort of pride position in all the architecture of your ideas because that idea of God is the idea of an infinite being. What he says is that the idea of anything else you have is not the idea of an infinite being. Think right now of, I don't know, anything. It could be like if you have a pet, dog or cat. I mean, I have a cat. You guys have met my cat, sort of. When I think of her, I think of something that it's sad to say, but she's finite. She has limits, right? She's not going to be there forever. She has a beginning, middle, and end. So it's something that's got limitations in space and time, something that doesn't always exist and won't always exist, and it's not everywhere all at once. But when you think of God, you're thinking of something that is actually infinite, having no limitations. So no beginning, no end, completely inexhaustible, and could be anywhere and everywhere. So the idea of God is not like the idea that you have of me, you, your car, Cal State Fullerton. All those things are ideas of stuff that had a beginning and that is destined to ultimately cease to exist. But the idea of God is the idea of an infinite thing. Okay, so that he believes is also important. And it leads us to the next premise of the argument. So once again, I'm going to erase here, and I'm going to explain a few things. Then I'm going to add the fifth premise. Okay, so so when I was a student way back at UCLA in college, and I studied this Descartes stuff, I had a professor that gave me this next example to help me understand it a little bit. And I think it was helpful to me, so I'm going to just pass that down to you guys, all right? For a moment, and we'll return to the argument, of course, but just for the moment, think about this example I'm giving you. So say we have this container right here, all right? And let's just say this is called container B. I don't know if is that easy to read. Let me make sure it's very clear. B. This container B is filled with water, but how much is that? That's 1 gallon, right? 1 gallon is the amount of water currently in container B. Now, all I'm going to add to this is the following piece of info. This container number B, which has a gallon of water in it, it received that gallon from another container, which we call labeled container A. Okay? Now, A. I have a very simple question, I hope, for you. Since A deposited the water into B, and since B has 1 gallon in it, we can logically deduce that the size of A, in terms of its storage capacity, has to be at least how much? At least how much volume must A have if it is the source from which B got that gallon? A basically has to be greater than or equal to how much carrying capacity? Exactly, 1 gallon. Correct? It has to be at least a gallon or more, because let's suppose it was smaller than a gallon. Like suppose A was a half gallon. Then of course this would make no logical sense. It would not make sense to say a half gallon container deposited 1 gallon of water into B. It's not physically possible, right? So knowing that B holds a gallon, knowing that it got that from somewhere, means that wherever it got it from had to have at least a gallon of space. Good? So now, this is going to be an analogy. And I'm going to erase those things and replace them with different things. So I want you to now think of yourself and your mind as kind of being the container B. So here's a human stick figure. Now to be precise, I probably shouldn't even draw the stick figure because it implies that there's a body that exists. And for the time being, we're saying who knows if that's even true. But I have to draw something. I can't just draw, like think of it. So there's a person, let's say, and here's in their mind this thought. And it's the thought of God. Now, what did he say about this thought of God that's in your mind? He says you've got an idea of God, but it's an idea of what kind of being? An infinite being. So I'm just drawing like the infinity symbol here. That's the idea that is in your head of God, the idea of something infinite. What he's saying now is this. That idea in your mind of God has to come from some source. Like, right, it has to come from somewhere. So, question. Since something caused your idea of God, and your idea of God has infinite reality in it, how much reality must the cause have at least? If it's going to give you an idea of God, and the idea has infinite reality, then how much reality has this cause of the idea have got to have? Okay? Like this now is like the container holding a certain amount of water, if you will, as a metaphor, deriving its contents from some other external source. But this external source, to give it that much reality, has to have at least infinite reality. Exactly, Sarush. So the cause of my idea of God has to itself have infinity of reality to impart to the effect. Okay? So you guys are right, Abraham, Nicole, Sarush, Kyle, and Rami. That therefore shows that there's something that caused my idea of God with how much reality? Infinite. And this basically just means that there really is God, that God does exist, because no other thing, no finite thing, could possibly have caused me to have the idea of God, right? That would be like saying something with less space is the cause of that 1 gallon being in the container B, which is physically impossible. So he's basically working backwards from the idea that you have the idea of God in your mind. We can therefore deduce that whatever is the source of that idea, the cause of it, has to be something with infinite reality, and therefore there really must be a God. Why does there have to be a God again? Because we have an idea of him. And he's saying there's no other way the idea could have been in the mind if it had not been caused by something with at least that much reality. And a thing that has infinite reality that causes you to have the idea of God is just God. Okay? So now we can return to our argument and the premises. So fifth premise. Since the idea of God has infinite reality, it must be caused by a being with infinite reality. and so therefore God exists. So, sixth premise, so therefore, so God exists. Okay? Now, this is a key point in the building of the argument. He's led us to the point within the argument where we're reaching the conclusion that God exists, but we're not done yet. There's more steps in the argument. But let's retrace our steps and make sure that we see how we got here. It starts by him just observing that the method of doubt allows you to doubt so much. Everything you perceive with your senses, even stuff that you think you know from mathematical intuition. But something that can't be doubted is the certainty that you exist, at least as a mind, just because you're thinking. Okay, so from there, you've got ideas in this mind that is yours. One of those ideas is the idea of God. And he says that is unique and different from every other idea because it's the idea of an infinite being. Now, based on what we've just said, the cause of that idea must have at least that much reality, because otherwise there never would have been the idea in your mind, because it couldn't have been caused by something with less than infinite reality. So there must actually be this being which causes your idea of God, and the only possible being that has infinite reality which could cause it is God, so God exists. From there we get to the next step. The seventh premise says that because God exists, God is known to be perfectly good. So since God exists and is known to be perfectly good, omnibenevolent, that means that he is not a deceiver. Okay, so that's our seventh premise. Since God exists, and is not, and is perfectly good, he is not a deceiver. Not a deceiver, because God really exists and he's perfectly good. Okay, so what he's saying next is this. If we've proven that God exists, which he thinks he has proven, because how else could you have the idea of him, basically? The idea is too great to come from anything else besides God, so there really is this God. And with the idea that God's existence is proven, we can say that he's known, among other things, to be perfectly good. Now, if a being is perfectly good, that means that he would not deceive you, because to deceive is not good. To deceive is bad. So God is not bad at all. He's good to an infinite degree. Therefore, he's not the one that deceives. And that is important to lead to our eighth premise. Since God's not a deceiver, what Descartes tells you is that that means that clear and distinct perceptions must be true. Okay, so I'm going to erase these, and I'm going to start at the top with number premise 8. Okay, so since God is not a deceiver, clear and distinct perceptions must be true. Let me just, sorry if I may, I just want to put one additional little word right in between those. Since God is not a deceiver, when I have clear and distinct perceptions, they must be true. Must be. Okay, so since God would not deceive you, that means that whenever you do have clear and distinct perceptions, they have to be true. Okay, so the idea being stated here is that given the fact that God is good and that he really exists and he's perfectly good, that means he would not want to deceive his creations, which is us. And he would be deceiving us if very, very fundamental things that we think are so obvious and clear were false. That would be deceptive. Like right now, you think you're watching this lecture on your device, right? But imagine that your whole life's a dream and none of this is really happening, and you're actually unable to see reality because God's creating this big illusion. If that was the real situation, then you'd be getting everything wrong all the time. And that would mean that the most natural, obvious beliefs would be false. That would mean that God had set you up just to fail. And that would be completely inconsistent with his perfect goodness. Kenzie, you say is not showing oneself, not deceiving. I mean, that's a tricky question. I think that what Descartes would probably say is God does provide for the means to discover that he exists through rational intuition. Like Descartes thinks he's just proven that he exists in this argument. So he would say he is kind of showing himself because he provides us with the intellectual tools we do need to form a deductively valid argument that he exists. And then you could also make the case, as you saying, Rami, that he did, show himself. If you take the Christian religion as your faith, then you'd say that he became incarnate when he, he turned into flesh as Jesus, ultimately leading to the sacrifice for the sins of mankind. But of course, there are other religions too. Nonetheless, I don't want to dive too far into the weeds of what counts as not being deceptive. All he's saying is that if you have a clear and distinct perception, those have to be true. Where there's no clear and distinct perception, then there's no responsibility God has to ensure that those things are true. But when things are evident, obvious, and you would never really usually doubt them, unless you're in a weird philosophy class where they're saying maybe life's a dream. If these things would just be obvious common sense, then God would not want you to get those things wrong, because that would just be manipulative and twisted and weird and mean. But he's not like that. He's too good to do that. So what we take away from this is that when you have clear and distinct perceptions, they're guaranteed to be true. And that guarantee is backed by the perfect goodness of God. He would not let you get the things wrong that seem so obvious to you. Okay, so let's get into the next step then. The ninth premise of the argument then says this. It's a key premise. It says that one of my clear and distinct perceptions is that if two things can be clearly conceived of as existing separately in the mind, then they can actually exist separately in reality. Okay, so I'll put it here. One of my clear and distinct perceptions is that if I can clearly conceive of two things existing separately in my mind, then they can actually exist separately in reality. Let me say it this way. Just two words I wanted to change at the end, if you don't mind. One of my clear and distinct perceptions is that if I can clearly conceive of two things existing separately in my mind, then they really are two separate things in reality. Then they actually are two separate things in reality. I'm coming close to the bottom here, and I'm going to write this in the chat so you'll see it written clearly. Okay, so I'm just going to underline some of the key points in this, and I'm going to type it in the chat. But it says, one of my clear and distinct perceptions is that if I can clearly conceive of two things existing separately in my mind, then that means that they actually are two separate things in reality. Okay, so let me just put that here in case I know it's a little illegible, so I'm going to write it up here. Okay, so hopefully you guys could just see that written there in the chat as a sort of backup to the written notes that I have here on the board. And like, I'm now going to explain that. So what he's saying here is this. If, for example, you can clearly imagine two things existing separately from each other, then that means that they actually really could be separated from each other. Like, I'll give you this example right now. You see me and my arm and my body. Here's my wristwatch. Now, me and the wristwatch, we're not separated right now. It's on my wrist. Like, it's touching my wrist, I'm touching it. So it's connected to me. But can you, using your imagination, clearly imagine me and this watch existing separately? Is that possible to imagine? Easy enough question, right? I mean, I'm wearing it right now. But could you imagine a situation taking place where me and this watch are separated? Clearly, yeah. Okay, clearly. Like, I could even just demonstrate. Do I have to demonstrate to see that it really could happen? No, because it's clearly conceivable already. So obviously, you know, me and the watch don't have to be together to each exist. I can take it off right now and you'll see that. So there it goes. The watch is off. I'm over here. The watch is over there. We're in two different places, so we can exist separately. Now, what this is just saying is that anytime you can clearly imagine two things that whether they're linked together right now or whether they're mingled together right now, if you can imagine those two things being separated from each other, if that's clearly conceivable, then those two things really could be separated from each other, meaning that they don't have to be connected. And so let me read this from his own words. Okay, it's a key quote on page 556. So here's what it says. So he says, first, I know that everything which I clearly and distinctly understand is capable of being created by God so as to correspond exactly with my understanding of it. Therefore, the fact I can clearly and distinctly understand one thing apart from another is enough to make me certain that the two things are distinct, since they are capable of being separated, at least by God. The question of what kind of power is required to bring about such a separation does not affect the judgment that the two things are distinct. Thus, and then we'll get to the next point in a moment, but being able to clearly imagine the separation of two things means that they actually could exist in separation, independently, separately from each other. Now, some things are easier to detach from each other than others. When it comes to me and the watch, easy, I already showed you that. Or if it's, you know, me and these glasses, you know, same thing. Other things that happen to be connected are a little harder to disentangle. Take a cup of like salt water. This is salty water because salt has dissolved into the water. Now, it might be hard for you to think about how can I get the salt content separated from the water, but of course there are procedures that do that. A desalinization tank could boil the water, allow the condensation to collect, deposit that in a separate container, and now you got the water and the salt separated from each other. But even if it's a little harder to do, it still is clearly conceivable that that could happen, and thus, once again, the two things, though they're linked together in the content of the salt water, they don't have to be, and they can exist. The salt can exist here, and the water exists in another part of space. Now, I'm going to erase this because we just have one more important premise of the argument, and then we'll get to that conclusion that we've been building towards. So let me erase here. So the point we were just now discussing is that if two things could be clearly thought of as existing separately, then those two things could actually exist separately from each other. And according to Descartes, based on the method of doubt, he says that we can clearly conceive of what two things about us existing separately, right? So that's our premise. We're on number 10, am I correct? So I can clearly and distinctly conceive of, think about Descartes' method of doubt, right? He says that it's possible for what and what to exist separately when it comes to you. We can clearly conceive of the possible separation of what from what in terms of you, the individual. You can imagine yourself, what? You can imagine what two things existing separately. Mind and body, exactly, so Rush. So I can clearly and distinctly conceive of my mind and body existing separately. So this line means the conclusion comes below. And if you're following this argument and you keep the steps in mind, then you can tell me what the conclusion is now. Okay, so let's trace our steps back and then if we can state the conclusion. It starts with the method of doubt. He says, using that method, I can doubt everything I perceive with my five senses, or I could even doubt math and logic. But one thing remains totally dead certain, and that is that you exist, at least as a mind, because you're thinking. In your mind, there are different ideas. One of them is the idea of God. But this idea is different and it's unique because it's the idea of an infinite being. Whatever caused that idea has to have at least infinite reality. And that would imply that God exists, because that's the only thing that could have infinite reality, which could cause this idea. So God exists. And God is known to be perfectly good. Therefore, he is not a deceiver. And since he's not a deceiver, when you have clear and distinct perceptions, they're guaranteed to be true. Now, one of those clear and distinct perceptions is that if two things could be clearly understood existing separately in your mind, then they actually could be separated in reality. And this last premise says that I can clearly conceive of my mind and body existing separately. So therefore, since I can clearly conceive of them existing separately, the conclusion is that therefore what? I can clearly imagine or comprehend my mind and body being divided from each other, and therefore they must be what? What do you think? Just tell me what you would say this conclusion is going to be, and then I'll write it. I can clearly conceive of my mind existing separately from my body. So what? So therefore what? I've led you all the way to the promised land. Just take me to the next step. So the result is, so Rush, no, you're getting a little off here. Descartes is giving an argument for what position again? Let's all make sure that we're clear about it. He's giving an argument for dualism. So let's not mistake what's happening. None of this discussion today has anything to do with monism. It's dualism. Okay, so the conclusion, you guys are correct. Alan, Rami, well, Alan, your way of putting it is a little more poetic. That's true, I guess, but the conclusion, as we would say it here, is that the mind and the body are two separate things. So therefore, the mind and the body are two separate things. That's the conclusion, but that is just dualism. That's all dualism says. The dualism says that there's two different substances which make up all of reality, both mind and matter. But if you have got both, if you are most essentially the thinking mind, but attached to you is this physical body, then that is a proof right there that there's more than just one substance, namely there's also the mind. So the argument overall is kind of based on the idea of conceivability. What he's saying is it's clearly conceivable for you to think of the mind and the body existing separately. Now, since you're living right now and you're watching this lecture, clearly your mind and your body are connected right now, just like me and the watch were a moment ago. But let me get your question, Soroush. You say, does dualism also say that they coexist at the same time, compared to monism, which is one or the other? Okay, good question. So in monism, there's either physicalism or idealism. But let's kind of just set idealism to the side, because I really don't want us to spend any more time thinking about it than what I already said. We're really interested in physicalist monism versus dualism. Okay, now what physicalism says is that everything's made out of matter. And when you're thinking and feeling and having ideas, that's just the brain. There's no spirit, there's no soul, there's just the neurochemistry and synapses of the brain. And when the brain's dead, there's no life, there's no survival, there's no consciousness, because it's a physical thing. It's not a spiritual or soul thing. On dualism, though, there's two substances. There's mind, which has no parts in space, which is not built out of matter, which is just an immaterial, purely conscious being. And then there's objects that are extended in space that are made out of atoms, including your body, but also all the other objects in space around you. So what dualism says is that, yes, both substances exist, mind and matter. And in monism, it's take your pick. If it's physicalism monism, then it's all matter. And idealist monism says it's all mental. Okay, now this argument, as I was saying, is based on the concept of conceivability. He's saying that because it's clearly conceivable, meaning that you can think or imagine the mind and the body existing separately, therefore, they really can exist separately, because that's clear and distinct, and God would not want to be fooling you or deceiving you into thinking that that's clear and distinct, but yet it's not true. Okay? What does this mean, that you can clearly conceive of your mind existing separately from your body? Well, one way of thinking about it is through the framework of the method of doubt itself. Because according to the method of doubt, you don't even know that you have a body right now. Right now, your apparent body, we're saying, who knows, it could be that that's a big dream. And if you're open to the possible case of your mind right now just dreaming this body, then it's possible that there's no body whatsoever and there's only the mental part that's thinking. Another way of thinking about the scenario of the mind and the body existing separately is through the common mention that you hear of these like near-death experiences that people talk about, right? So say someone got into like a traumatic accident and now they're in surgery in a coma or something, and the doctors are trying to save their lives. You've heard of people, a couple people sometimes, and I'm not saying I agree with this or claiming it as a scientific fact or anything, but like some people will say that, okay, I had this weird out-of-body experience, and I sort of remember floating above my own body, looking down at the operating table and the surgical team, and wondering whether or not they're going to be able to save my life, but I'm kind of like free floating in the room like this disembodied soul, spirit, mind, whatever you want to call it. So because you can conceive of like, I don't know, yourself dying and then still surviving in the afterlife as like a ghost, or because you can imagine the method of doubt revealing the possibility that everything perceived by your senses is not real and really you're just a disembodied mind, because those things are possible to conceive of, there really has to be this ability for your mind and your body to exist separately. And that would show that they're not the same thing. The body would remain behind, the mind would escape and be free from it. And in that case, we see for real that there's definitely two different substances. So it's based on conceivability of the mind and the body existing separate from each other. And he's saying that God is the guarantee that that clear and distinct perception of their possible separation can't be false. So now I want to return to his words again and just read you this part of his text. He says here, thus, simply by knowing that I exist and seeing at the same time that absolutely nothing else belongs to my nature or essence except that I am a thinking thing, I can infer correctly that my essence consists solely in the fact that I am a thinking thing. It is true that I may have a body that is very closely joined to me, but nevertheless, on the one hand, I have a clear and distinct idea of myself insofar as I am simply a thinking, non-extended thing. And on the other hand, I have a distinct idea of body insofar as this is simply an extended, non-thinking thing. That's a good quote from page 556 because he gives his definition again of mind and matter. The body is something extended, which is not thinking. The mind is something which is not extended and which is thinking. And since I can imagine these two things being separate from each other, therefore they must really be capable of being separated. Now, in an easy example of like me and my glasses, if I ask you, can you imagine clearly in your mind me and the glasses being separated? That's easy because it's something that you see people do all the time, taking on, an article of clothing or glasses and putting it back on. What about you and your body? Your mind, the thinking part that's watching this lecture, that's understanding these concepts, and then the just physical body that I guess is along for the ride or whatever as you go through life as a composite of the two. Well, it's not going to be so easy for you to demonstrate those two things being separated, and he claims that only God, I guess, is the one that's going to be able to do it. But if you believe in the afterlife, and if you believe in the soul, then none of this is really hypothetical to you. In that case, you believe that it will happen, that you will no longer be a physical object which exists, because the processes of entropy are going to destroy your body over time. But if you believe that your consciousness could survive and persist on, then you've already entertained this possibility of the mind being one place, soul, spirit, whatever you want to call it, and the body remaining behind in the grave as it decomposes. So this is the idea of dualism, that you're not just that body, that you are really actually not the body at all, but just the mind that somehow inhabits it. And that at a certain date in the future, the separation of mind and body will be affected by the event of your death and the action of God as he reclaims your soul. So that's an argument for dualism, everybody. Let me just repeat the major points in it one last time. He's saying that there's a method of doubt which allows you to doubt almost everything. But something that even that cannot doubt is that you exist as a mind because you're thinking. And yeah, she is studying those notes. She's crazy cat, but she's a good girl. So you've got the idea of you exist because you're thinking. And in your mind, there are ideas. One of those ideas is the idea of God, which is unique because it's an infinite idea. That has to come from an infinite source. So God must really be there. Otherwise, you would not have had this idea, and you couldn't have. But you do, so there's got to be a God. Well, God's good, and he's perfectly good. So he would not mess with you and deceive you and trick you. At least not about the things that are the most clear and distinct. So here's one thing that's clear and distinct. When two things could be thought of being separated from each other, and you can clearly see that in your mind, then those two same things can actually exist separately in real reality. And the last bit is just that you can clearly and distinctly conceive of your mind existing separate from your body. So therefore we get our conclusion that they really are two separate things. Just as much as me and these glasses, just as much as me and the watch, you, the mind that's thinking, and the whole body that you're in, those two things can and will be separated at some time too. And therefore there's two substances, not just the one. Now after that, that's really it. That's the main content of today's lecture that I wanted to make sure everyone knows. The argument for dualism given by Descartes. Let's see if I have more on that. Well, that's really the main essence of what I wanted to show you in this part of the lecture. And so what you're saying here, Sarush, is he saying the body is 100% real? Good question. That takes me to the next thing I actually is just now going to mention. So there's a little bit more of these clear and distinct perceptions that Descartes thinks we can also place confidence in. So one of them is that the mind and the body are two separate things, but there's a little more on that. So let me add to this. Okay, so other clear and distinct perceptions. Okay, so here are like some other things, aside from what I just mentioned, that the mind and the body are separate. Here are some other things that he also believes are clear and distinct, and thus they got to be true, because God would not let you get these clear and distinct things wrong. So one of them is that the external world exists. And then the other one I'll put here is that I do have a body. So for the first one, that the external world actually does exist. Let me go over that. And Sarush, I mean, your last question is kind of pertaining to this point that he's going to make next, so we'll get to it. But okay, like, remember that Descartes started the meditations by saying, hey, who knows, does the external world exist? I mean, it looks like it, but it could just be a big dream. So, all bets are off. Maybe it's not even real. Maybe it's a big fake simulation or dream. But now he's prepared to say, actually, never mind that. There is really the external world. But why is he saying it now and not in the beginning? Because now in the sixth meditation, he's got this new ammo. He's armed with this proof that God exists and that God is so good that he would not let clear and distinct perceptions go wrong. And it's clear and distinct, your perception, that the external world exists. But let's try and get into the details of why that is so clear, okay? Now, I know no one's probably ever asked you this, but now it's philosophy, so what? You got to deal with it. What do you think? What would you say to somebody if they asked you, why do you believe that the external world exists? What makes it seem like it's not just a dream? What makes it seem like it's actually really real? What is it about your experience of the world that makes you think it's not just a dream I'm having in my head, but there's something outside of me that's really real, that exists, that's different from me? What would make a person think that seems so clear and distinct? It might be hard for you to formulate a quick response, which is fine. But there's a couple points on that Descartes makes. I wonder if anyone had a thought that maybe would connect to it. Okay, so Caitlin, you say, because we have confirmation from everyone else, but you don't know that the other people exist. That's not necessarily something you should say, because if we're going to claim that, the method of doubt is possible, then maybe these other people are just phantoms. They're not even real, like when you have dreams. So Rami, you're saying, because it's physical and I can interact with it and I seem to have free will. Kind of, I guess, but again, you just kind of are assuming that it's real instead of a simulation. But the question I'm asking is sort of a little deeper. You say you can distinguish between dreams and reality. Okay, well, we're getting closer. We're getting at the ballpark of the right, I think, point that he wants to make here. So Rush, you say there's good and bad. That's a little hard for me to interpret for the moment, but I'm going to keep working with it as I think. Alan, you say, because I can conceive an inside world. Oh, because you can like mentally think of like an entirely simulated scene, and so you're thinking, well, that would be what a fake world would be like, but this is like knock on the table. It seems like it's real. Well, these are all great suggestions, guys, so I don't want you to think that anything you're saying is any way off. It's all very good, but there's a couple of very precise points he makes here, so I want us to be able to surely know those. So here's what he says that gives us clear and distinct perception that the external world is not just a big illusion or dream, that it really exists. Interesting point, so I'll make them right here. Why is this clear? Question. Okay, question is, why is that clear? Answer. Okay, here's a few reasons. First of all, because I cannot choose what I would like to perceive. So I cannot perceive whatever I wish. I cannot control what I perceive. I cannot control what I perceive, and then also, another point, I cannot perceive only that which is favorable. Okay, so let me go over those two reasons really quick. If this world you're living in was a big dream and wasn't actually real, then what kind of perceptions do you think your mind would give you? If you're just living in a dream, then probably if you're the one that's the author of the dream, then maybe you'd be able to control what you perceive, and you would only perceive what kind of things. Like imagine that this world is just a dream you're having. What would you want this dream to have in it? Right? I'm just giving you that possible hypothesis. Say the world around you is the big illusion. If so, then it's kind of something that you're dreaming up. And if it's your dream, well, Abraham, you're saying something. You'd say you'd bring things into existence that don't really exist. Maybe so. I was kind of going for a different angle here, though. That's a fair point, but I was kind of thinking about this second here. If everything in the world's just based on your mind thinking it, then what kind of world would it be? You'd think it would be a world that was exactly what you wanted, right? So you'd only perceive the things that were favorable. But that's not how it works, right? Like, for example, if you were living in a big dream, then where would you find your keys if you ever lost them? You'd probably find them, for example, where? I'm saying imagine this world's not real and it's a dream, but you lose your keys in the so-called dream. If that happened and it was a dream, then because it's not actually an objective reality, you'd probably just find the keys where? Under the couch, or the first place that you looked. I mean, you're giving me weird suggestions, attic and stuff, but like what I was trying to just fish out from you is you'd find them in the first place that you'd look, right? Because that would be the most convenient place. Why would you want to have to spend a whole bunch of wasted time looking around for these keys if the most useful and favorable thing would be to find them in the very first place you look? In fact, let me ask you this. Would you even lose the keys in the first place if this is a dream world? No, because losing keys and having to find them is annoying. So you'd think that the experiences that you had would just be perfect in every way. This is a big dream, then you should be rich right now, and you should be completely at the height of your powers, not even having to study this class if you didn't want to. Because after all, you'd probably love to have a life of leisure where you didn't have to do any work. Yeah, they would just spawn in your pocket like a video game or something, right? But that's not how it happens. Also, suppose there are things that you don't want to have happening, right? If this world was just created by you and it's under the control of your imagination, then would like you ever get sick, or would this friggin' pandemic be happening, or would loved ones die? None of those things would happen. If the world was a mental construct, then unfavorable things would be avoided just by your will, and favorable things would be attained by that same will. But we see that's not how it happens. When you're sick and you're like, why do I have to be sick? You can't just make it go away with your mind. And I wish I could snap my fingers and say pandemic's over and we're back in class next week, but I don't have the control over the world because it's not a world that's built on my thoughts. It's an objective world that exists even if and when I no longer do. And it existed before I ever did also. Now here's another point. Just that you can't control what you perceive. That's kind of related to it, but that's not merely about favorable or unfavorable perception. So here's what I want you to do. If this world's a big dream, then I want you to just look to your right in your room where you're at right now, and I just want you to like visually perceive an alligator right there. Can you do that? No. You're not going to see it in the room, in the environment, unless you're on all kinds of drugs. You're just going to like think of one in your head, but you're not going to be able to like view one in the outside environment. And of course, if the world wasn't just a mental thing, then why should there be no ability to just decide what you're going to perceive? And of course, that's not how it happens, right? Make someone knock on your door right now if this world's just a dream. See, it's not happening. And that would indicate, right, that the world has its own objective existence that doesn't merely depend on what you think about it. There's actually one more point here. So we're going to get to I have a body, but I wanted to not let this last thing go. Another reason why it's so clear that the external world exists, and this is kind of, I think, a little weird and interesting. Another reason for that is because memories are less vivid than original perception. Less vivid, less clear than original perception is. So I want you guys to think for a minute about something that's true, but it's often overlooked. That when you have an experience in the present moment, it's much more detailed and vivid and clear than when you recall that experience later on in time. Okay? So like, for example, right now, we're having this lecture live. This is happening right now. So isn't it pretty vivid? You're like looking at me, you're hearing my voice, and we're having this interaction across these computers. Later on, maybe tomorrow or next week or maybe in a year, if you want to think back to this moment, it won't be happening live. It'll be in the past. So like right now, imagine the lecture that we experienced on Monday if you attended. Is your memory of that lecture as clear as it is when it's really happening? Or another way of putting it, this perception of this present moment, what's clearer? Having it happen right now in front of your eyes, or when you try to remember it in your mind's eye later on? Take, for example, the present moment of you watching this lecture. Isn't that more vivid than if you think back to your last birthday? Do you kind of see what I'm saying? Like when you remember things and when you put the memory in your mind, the memory is never quite as clear and in your face vivid as the moment is when you're having the experience in the present. Now, why should that give us evidence that the external world exists? Okay, what could possibly explain this drop off in clarity and vividness from the original point where the moment was experienced to the later on memorial recall of it? That seems to only be explainable by assuming that it's so vivid in the first place because that's when you're actually perceiving the external object. Later on, you're no longer in the presence of the object, and so it's not as vivid as when you were surrounded by those external things. Think back to our last class meeting, which I have a detailed memory of because it was March 16th, and on the next day, a series of closures pretty much shut our whole state and country down. But when we were in that class meeting, when you took the midterm, isn't that a little less clear in your memory than if you just look around your surroundings right now and you examine them? And the reason, again, that that's not as clear as it was when it was happening is because back then in the past when it was happening, you were in the classroom with all the other people and with the tables and chairs and at the campus. Now you're not at that campus. I know that much. And so why is it not so clear as when it was happening? Because you're not surrounded by the external objects anymore and you're simply trying to represent them in the mind's eye. So we can only explain the loss of vividness on the assumption that the original perceptions are when you're surrounded by the objects and the later memories of them are when you're no longer with those objects or with those events. Now, if everything in life was just a dream, right, then there would not be a discrepancy between the level of vividness of a present experience and a future memory of it, because they would both be mental. The experience in the moment would be a mental thing because it's all just fake and made up by your mind. And the memory of it at a later time would also just be the same. So it wouldn't be like one is when you actually have real perception of the external objects, whereas the other is just the mental reconstruction of them. And therefore, that discrepancy in the vividness and clarity is a further source of clear and distinct reason that the external world actually does exist. Okay? Abraham, you asked, can this connect to temporal parts? Yes, because you imagining or remembering the situation of an earlier temporal part in your timeline is not the same as being this current temporal part of the timeline and having its experiences live in the present moment. So that's a good connection. Very good. All right. So I also wanted to tell you guys briefly about the other thing there, which is that I have a body. Okay. So that's another clear and distinct perception. Let's go over that. Okay, so question, why is this clear? Why is this so clear? And then we're gonna try and give some basic possible answers to that. So, I mean, okay, let's just say you have a body. I think probably you already believe that, but now that we're dealing with this philosophy material, who knows? I guess there's reasons to possibly doubt it, but you believe you have a body. And what if a person asked you, how do you know? Like, what makes you think you have a body? And please don't just say, because I'm looking at it. Like, think of something else. Like, what makes you think that you have a body? What makes you think that it's yours? Weird question, but yeah, give me a weird answer. What makes you think it's your body? How do you even know you have a body? Could you give any reason why you think it's yours? I know you actually can't. So this is what I'm trying to see if you can give me. Okay, so Sarush, you say my limbs, but that's like what I'm saying. You can't just be like, because it looks like I have it. Let's go in a different direction. Kai, you say, because I can think I have a body. All right, Melissa, this is, I think, getting better. Because you can feel pain, right? All right, so when a stimulus is applied to your body, who feels the pain when that stimulus is given? You do. All right, so like, look, I'm just going to like pinch my own arm for half a second. Ouch. Now, did you feel that? No. Who felt it? Me. How come you didn't feel it? Because this is not your body, it's mine. Okay? And if you pinched yourself, why would it be that you feel the experience of the pain, but not other people? Because that's the body that you possess. So one reason to think this is clear, and I'm just going to get to all your guys' good comments here, but it's kind of Melissa's point, and that's relevant. It's that sensations arise for me when a stimulus is applied to this body, but not to others. And that gives you a sense of ownership over it. Because if it was just like you're, say, a captain riding along on a ship, but the ship is not part of the captain, then if like a cannonball hits that ship, he doesn't go, ouch. But if a projectile bullet or something hits you, you do say ouch. So it doesn't seem like you're disconnected from the body, that it is yours because you possess the sensations that correspond to stimuli that's given to it. Okay, so one reason is this. Why is this clear? Well, because I experience sensations in this body I experience sensations when a stimulus is given to this body but not others. Okay, that's one reason. And you guys are saying some really good stuff here. Kenzie, your point is also on this same topic. I can control the movement of this body, but I cannot control others. So I can control this body with my mind, but not others. But not others. Okay, I know it's a little messy there. I'll write that point here in the text. Okay, so I mean, think about this. If I say I'm going to snap my fingers, boom, it happens. Thought leads to the action. If I say I'm going to clap my hands, boom, I did it. But if I'm thinking right now, okay, these students watching this lecture, make them raise their hands. I can't just think and, affect your bodily motions. I could do it to me, the hand goes up. But if I'm thinking, Anthony's going to raise his hand right now, it's not going to cause you to do it. So there's a locus of control that my mind can exert over this physical body, but not others, deepening further the clear and distinct perception that it is, in fact, mine. Okay, and then one more important point that you just raised here, Anthony, is exactly what he says next, that you cannot detach yourself from this body, but you can remove yourself from every other body in space. So I'm just going to put that up here. A third reason here is this. I can't remove myself from this body. And that's not the case with any other body in the whole universe. So, this marker is right here in my hand, but I don't need it to be. I can get far away from it. I can leave it here, and I could go 5,000 miles away and leave it behind that far. And so we could gain a big space between each other. Your body, we used to all be in the same classroom, and then we would disperse at the end of the class. You go home, I go home. Now we're all separated in our own individual, respective houses and stuff, or residences, whatever they may be. But we've clearly got the ability to separate from each other. In fact, that's what we're told to do, distance. But you cannot socially distance from your own body, right? You can't, let's say, let me go on a little teleportation away from this body, leave it behind, and I'm just going to go wander around the world a little bit while my body stays back at home on the couch. So that's another reason to think that you inhabit this body and that it is yours. Because if it wasn't, then you'd be able to, let's say, separate yourself from it, unlike the others. Keep in mind, though, at the end of the day, Descartes does believe there's a possibility of existing separately from your body, but not by removing yourself from it in the typical way. That's something that only God can do, by separating your soul or mind from the body at death. But in the ordinary course of events, as a living being, your body is tied right up with the mind. Now, there's problems, I guess, that some have raised with Descartes' dualism, and so I'm just going to close with this. A major criticism that physicalists and monists give against all that is that how could the mind and the body be how could they interact with each other if they're two separate things? Because according to the dualist, there's both the mind and the body. But think about it, right? The mind, according to a dualist, is not part of the body. It's not got any extension in space. So how can something that literally doesn't have any place in space relate to and influence the body? That's very strange. If the two things are in separate realms, one is extended and made out of matter, and the other is completely immaterial, how can the two things have a connection? You talking about astral projection, Caitlin? It's a little pseudoscientific and woo-ish, I don't know, but people talk about that. And maybe if there is such a possibility, then that gives further evidence for the concept of the mind and body existing separately. But it's an exceptional circumstance. Have you ever done it? I don't think so. But anyway, the point I'm making here, that critics of this whole argument will make, is that it does not really make clear sense how mind and body can relate to each other or interact if one has no physical dimensions or location and the other one does. Now, Descartes realized that this so-called mind-body problem was a serious objection, but he does, I think, a very poor job of replying to it. Because if you read other works of his, he said this. So they're starting to do anatomy on the brain and other body parts, and they had discovered that there are different parts of the brain, even in Descartes' time period of life. They knew that there was this one part of the brain called the pineal gland, but at that time they had no idea really what it was doing. They couldn't figure out what its role was physiologically. So Descartes had this, I feel, kind of somewhat arbitrary assumption that the soul, or mind, if you want to call it that, takes up residence in the human pituitary gland of the brain, and then kind of like a, like a mech battle guy who's in a big robot suit, like it exerts control over the whole physical body from its perched position in your pineal gland. But I think of this as a solution that really doesn't quite solve the problem, because how could it position itself there or anywhere else if it's literally got no dimensions in space? You're not supposed to be thinking of like a tiny little pebble that's very small that you could find in the body if you just dissected it. You've got to be thinking of something that has no material nature or substance at all. So saying it's in the pineal gland is, to me, just kind of waving the problem away. And I think the mind-body problem still remains. That's not a problem for a physicalist. The physicalist does not have to give any account as to how mind and body connect, because to the physicalist, there is no mind. There's just the brain. And therefore, everything's physical. So the physical brain operates in a physical realm with other physical objects. And so, there's reasonable support for both ideas. But I wanted to give you guys the first taste of dualism. Now, as we know, and probably just due to the nature of how these lectures play out when they're done live stream versus in person, I have to wait a little longer for the responses and the interactions, so it kind of delays some of the presentation of the material. We're definitely going to finish all of this philosophy of mind stuff next week, but how much of the material of the last topic we'll get into, that's something that remains an open question. I'm going to try to get through as many of the additional notes so that I can at least talk to you a little bit about life and death at the end. But anyway, for Monday, what you should read is the work of Daniel Stoljar and J.J.C. Smart, and I will for sure cover those two pieces on Monday. Then for Wednesday, we could talk a little bit about Alan Turing, and also start talking a little bit about the value of life. So Rush, you say, can you repeat the physicalist point again? Just this point, that if you're a physicalist, sorry about the audio cutoff, but all I was trying to say is that a physicalist does not have a problem called the mind-body problem. It's only a problem for dualists, because only dualists say that both substances exist. The problem is to account for how they connect to each other and how they interact. But the physicalist does not have such a problem, because there's no question of interaction, since there's no claim that the mind exists, only the body. And a physicalist says there's just the brain. There's no immaterial soul or mind aside from the brain. So they don't have that problem. And that's a nice feature of their theory, I guess. Okay, guys, well, I know I've run a little over time. Sorry for that. But I appreciate everybody attending, and I really do hope you guys are having a great day and week. And we will certainly be back on Monday. Don't forget your papers that are due May 6th, so you have plenty of time to still work. Let me know if I can help anyway in between now and the next couple of dates. But for now, have a good one. Take care, and see you guys next time on Monday. Have a good weekend.